didn't want to be judged solely on the basis of appearance, that, that wasn't the essence of who I am, and that I didn't want to judge other people on that basis. Slowly it began to dawn on me, this isn't exactly just and true. And so at some point I did come up with this word. It felt like we needed a word in the vocabulary to describe this thing that I was so aware of. And I came up with the word appearance-ism. If you Google the word, I'm not the only person in the world who's ever used the word, but I think it's a good word, and I think it could be an important part of our vocabulary. And so I mean by that, judging based on appearance, judging ourselves, judging each other. And one revelation that I had at some point was that even people who really are those spectacular beauties, the people who are just born, so tall and such beautiful figures and faces and hair and all of it, that they understand the word appearance-ism too, that they get slotted into a box as well, and sometimes I think get very objectified and sort of treated like a beautiful it instead of a full-fledged person. The way that I arrived at this conclusion was that I was treating those people like beautiful its. So I figured if I'm doing it, I realized, yes, the tabloid magazines and other people are doing it too. The hardest person for me to talk to one-on-one, like when I meet somebody, and relate to kind of as a full-fledged human being, is a beautiful woman, like a tall, thin, beautifully dressed, beautiful woman. I kind of just can't quite get past that. It's like, that's the box that I see that person in, and it's very hard for me to get into, oh, okay, you're really a human being, just like me. And so I think we all get it, no matter where we are, ages, stages, where we are on the spectrum of size, shape, color, ethnicity, all of that. So a little exploration of, how this happens in cultures. Anybody know what that is? Any thoughts?
It's a Chinese shoe.
Oh, it is.
A shoe.
It's a Chinese, yes.
Oh my goodness.
So this is the actual size and shape of, this is a replica. I actually have a real one, an antique one at home, but I don't like to bring it to all the programs. This is a replica. This is the ideal size and shape for an adult Chinese woman during the era of foot binding, which was not an era that lasted a few decades or even 100 years. It lasted 1,000 years. And it just seems extraordinary, but let's see, I think I have a picture of that too. And so, what they would do is the foot binder would come around and take the little toddler girl and bend her foot upside down and bind it really very, very, very tightly and keep it bound and rebind it over and over and over again until eventually the foot would just, be deformed. But it was at a great price, there was gang anxiety. So for 1,000 years in China, this size, shape, and was the standard of beauty for an adult Chinese woman. This itsy bitsy teeny weeny little shoe. And even though it crippled girls, even though, they couldn't walk, even though they couldn't, dance and play, and maybe even died of gangrene complications, it still became so prevalent and so accepted. You just had to do it to your daughter, because if you didn't, she would not have stature and place in the culture. So that's a pretty dramatic example. And just this slide is a very interesting little array of photos. That would be, what the foot would look like after it was unbound, and then the X-ray of what it would look like, and the comparison between it and, what the foot would have looked like had it grown, and what it looked like, after that. And of course, all of these ideas of what's beautiful, you can pull thousands of images from cultures and times in history. So crazy, interesting, things. It includes men as well as women. We have, ideals and fashions. There are cultures where women have, these rings stacked on their necks, and if the rings are removed, they can't hold their heads up anymore. There's just, sometimes I wish I could do a whole series of classes on this, because it would be interesting to, you know, just separate out these issues and spend an hour on each of them in a way, you know, like just all these examples are so fascinating. But I'm not going to do that tonight. We could rattle off all kinds of things: liposuction, breast implants, tanning booths, tattooing,
Botox.
piercing, Botox. You know, there's just a whole host of
Penile
things.
enhancement.
Yes, sorry, enhancement.
Penile
Penile enhancement, that as well. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And some of the things that we do become normalized for us. So when we see a woman with red nails, we don't go, oh, Chinese bound foot shoe hands. But there is a way in which that, I mean, it's not as deforming and, you know, crippling, but why is that the norm? You know, I don't know how. That would be interesting, but I don't know how that became the norm, or red lips, or, you know, all of the things that we do that have just become normalized in our culture. That, you know what's so interesting? If you watch an old James Bond movie, like the really old ones with Sean Connery, with the Bond girls don't look like the Bond girls now, because they're not plastic surgery enhanced. So they look more like real women, and they have a little bit of, you know, meat on their bones, and James Bond doesn't look the way the male standard is now. He, you know, not as kind of bulky and buff. Yeah, so it's really interesting what has happened for us. And arbitrary is basically means unreasonable. You know, there's no particular reason why these things make sense, but when you're in the culture, you tend to get swept up in it because you almost can't avoid getting swept up in it. Like, why do we all wear blue jeans? Because, I don't know, we're not wearing togas, we're not wearing kilts, you know. It's the norm, it's what's kind of regular for us. I know there's a whole body of literature that talks about that we have a built-in innate sense of beauty, and people have done studies that little babies will stare longer at the face of a beautiful woman whose eyes are this big and whose symmetry is this much and whose face is heart-shaped and blah, 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 blah. And I don't know. I'm not a social scientist. I haven't done the research. I haven't even studied it. I just know that research is out there. But I don't really totally agree with that, or much agree with that, because I think there is this overlay of what we consider the norm, and I think that the baby that grew up in the culture where the women have the stacked copper necklaces is going to respond to her mommy with the stacked copper necklaces, and that will be her standard of beauty, and our standards of beauty are formed by our culture as well, to a tremendous extent, that it's not innate.